Welcome back to the weekend here on Sports Radio 910. Anthony Opperman, joined now by Chris Dunnavant from the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries, as it's time once again for our weekly wildlife conversation. And, Chris, we've had a tendency to take this segment in different directions a couple of times throughout the run of this show. Of course, predominantly we talk fishing, but we've had Bob Duncan in here talking hunting and specifically turkey calls and all that good stuff. And we're going to go a completely different direction here this morning.
That's right. The Department of Game and Inland Fisheries certainly has the hunting, the fishing, the boating, but we have a lot of different aspects of wildlife that we cover, and really want to take an opportunity to bring some of that to light. We have a guest today, Steve Living. He's a terrestrial biologist for the department. He's been with the department for 6 years. And, I've read Steve's bio, and I'm just going to let Steve, welcome this morning, Steve, but I also want to just let you tell us what a terrestrial biologist is and what do you do for the department?
Good morning, Chris. Good morning, Anthony. Thanks for having me today. A terrestrial biologist is essentially, we're with our Bureau of Wildlife Resources, and we're focused on all the species that are on land. Particularly, I focus on our Watchable Wildlife Program, which is our effort to provide services for our constituents that are interested in wildlife viewing, and also promote wildlife conservation using ecotourism and wildlife viewing as a venue.
Steve, I guess first and foremost, how did you get into this? What was it about this that really was interesting to you, and why is this your passion?
I have always, since I was a kid, just been enamored of the outdoors, spent all my time outside, playing in the woods and ponds and streams, much to my mother's chagrin, I'm sure. But I've just always felt really connected to it and want to share that with as many people as I can. I think it's important that we conserve that amazing resource that we have.
I know one of the things we wanted to focus on specifically this morning was bird watching. What is it about this that people can find fascinating or interesting? I mean, when you just go out and look around, initially, what are some of the things people should even look for or can observe?
Well, I think what often amazes people is how much diversity is around them all the time, even in suburban and urban areas. We just have an amazing bird diversity in Virginia. So sitting on your back porch, if you take the time to look around, you'll start to notice that there's a lot of birds out there and a lot of different species. Even in, say, downtown Richmond last week, we worked to monitor the fledging of peregrine falcons from a building in downtown Richmond. And I have to tell you, folks downtown were pretty amazed to look up and find out what we were doing.
That does sound pretty amazing. Tell us a little bit about that. What was that like?
It's really impressive. There's a pair of falcons that nest in downtown Richmond, and the department actively manages and monitors that nest. And when it comes time for those birds to leave the nest, it can be kind of a challenge for peregrines to learn how to navigate in the urban glass canyons downtown. We organize DGIF staff and volunteers, and for a few days we just kind of monitor and make sure those young birds are flying well, make sure they don't get into any trouble, and if they do, we're there to assist as needed. And it's also a great outreach opportunity for us. We talked with hundreds of folks downtown who had no idea that the state-threatened bird was nesting and thriving in that urban environment.
Yeah, where are they nesting at specifically, Steve?
They're on top of the Riverfront Plaza West Tower downtown.
Nice. That probably a lot of folks, they're not aware of that. And is there any way they can find some more information about that?
Yeah, actually, they can go. We have a webcam that features that nest, so folks can actually follow the progress of these birds from their early breeding attempts to eggs being laid and hatching, right up to when they leave the nest. And they can find that on our website. If they go to the dgif.virginia.gov and look for the Wildlife Watching tab on the left side, they'll find links to our wildlife cams, and the falcons are featured there.
Stephen Living, Terrestrial Biologist from the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries, our weekly wildlife conversation, along with Chris Dunnavant from the DGIF. And, Steve, obviously for the casual observer of wildlife, you've got your feeders, your bird baths, those types of things out in the yard. But if somebody wanted to get a little bit more advanced into observing birds specifically, how would they go about doing that?
Well, there's some pretty basic equipment that most birders or bird watchers are using, and binoculars are going to be important. A good field guide. Field guides are basically just books that are helping you to identify the birds that you may be seeing. And, of course, in this day and age, those guides are offered in electronic formats, too. You can get them for your smartphones and your tablets, and you can carry that information with you. As far as getting binoculars, I recommend that folks, buy the best binoculars that they can afford if they're interested, and they won't regret it. You can spend a lot of money on optics. You don't have to buy the best, but a good pair is important. And I think, linking up with local groups that are interested in birds. There's local Audubon societies. There are state organizations like the Virginia Society of Ornithology, and they have a listing of all their local chapters. And many of these chapters will sponsor bird walks and lead bird walks at local parks and natural areas. And that's a great way to learn with people that are experienced and can point things out to you and make your trips a little more enjoyable.
Where would folks go to find out those specific lists and groups?
For Virginia, the Virginia Society of Ornithology, and that is virginiabirds.net. And as far as local, there's also the Richmond Audubon, and folks could find that by just Googling Richmond Audubon. And that's a very active and well-organized group.
Oh, thanks, Steve. I really appreciate that. For me, everybody knows that listens to the program that I'm a big fisherman, but I also really enjoy birds. And how I got started was with a bird feeder behind my house and hummingbird feeders. And then, of course, I got, just like you just recommended, I got a field guide, started identifying different birds. And the more you do that, the more you get interested in it. You start to, at first, you're like, I don't even know anything. I don't know the names of these birds. But over time, you develop that knowledge and you can then spot birds. And then when you're driving somewhere and you see a bird that you haven't seen before, you want to get back home and look in your field guide and try to identify it. And it really is very enjoyable. And one thing I did before our conversation is I went on our website and I looked up the Virginia Birding and Wildlife Trail. And I had never done that before, admittedly. I'd heard a lot about it, but I'd never really looked on our website and investigated it. And I found it to be fascinating that the trails that we have, for example, in the Richmond area, we have the Henrico Loop and the Richmond Loop. But to me, it looks like there are more opportunities than just birding. There's lots of wildlife and flora and fauna to see and historic sites. And I'm sure along the way you're going to see and do and have opportunities to do all kinds of different things that maybe you didn't take that opportunity before. But can you tell us a little bit more about the Virginia Birding and Wildlife Trail and maybe even some things about the Henrico and Richmond area trails?
Sure. The Virginia Birding and Wildlife Trail is the first statewide viewing trail that's been completed. A lot of state wildlife agencies have these kind of efforts, and they're to provide the citizens of the Commonwealth the great resource on where to find places to view wildlife. But again, it's also an ecotourism effort. We want folks to come to Virginia and enjoy our natural resources. So that's hunting, fishing, and wildlife viewing. And ecotourism is a pretty big business. So this helps to support local communities in that effort. What the trail does is it organizes the best wildlife viewing sites in Virginia into local loops, and it provides site descriptions and directions on how to get to these sites and what folks can expect when they're there. And it's a great resource for a beginning birder because, again, if you don't know where to go, that can be one of the stumbling blocks. So this is a great way to start. And it's available on the agency website in its entirety. And again, if they go to dgif.virginia.gov and look for that watchable wildlife, wildlife watching link on the left-hand side. It'll take them to the Virginia Birding and Wildlife Trail. As far as the Richmond and Henrico loops, unfortunately, I'm not as familiar with them as I'm down in the Tidewater, but there are some great sites there, with the James River running through Richmond and the park system associated with that. That's a great spot. Anytime you have kind of more than one habitat feature coming together, so a river and the wetlands and forests that are along its edge, that's just a rich spot to find wildlife.
Well, I agree, and when I looked at these the Henrico Loop and the Richmond Loop, like I said, I'm pretty much a backyard birder. I like my birds in the backyard, and starting to notice them. Of course, when I'm out fishing and things like that, I really appreciate them. But I read the descriptions of these loops, and I was just really interested. I'm really looking forward to taking an opportunity, investigating it myself, and I would encourage our listeners to go to our website, look up the Virginia Birding and Wildlife Trail. I think you'll be as interested as I am, and it'd be a great way to take a Saturday and go out and tour around and enjoy the resources we have right here in the Richmond area. They seem to be plentiful, and I think it could be a real fun opportunity with friends, family, or if you just want some time to get out and have some quiet and enjoy nature, I think it'd be a great chance.
Absolutely, and the other neat thing in Virginia as a whole, but especially in the Richmond area, is that a lot of these sites are going to have interest beyond wildlife viewing. There's so many historic sites, so you can spend a day and visit a Civil War battlefield for its historical benefit, and see all the wildlife that's using those important open areas.
Stephen Living, terrestrial biologist from the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries, joining us here on the weekend, along with Chris Dunnavant from the DGIF, our weekly wildlife conversation. Steve, how much time do you spend observing wildlife and nature out of your day, just a given day? How much time do you get to spend outdoors and observing?
Well, I'm really lucky that I have a position that enables me to be out. So there may be days where I'm out for 10 or more hours out in the field, and I'm constantly kind of cataloging in my mind and observing wildlife, listening to bird calls and watching. But honestly, I kind of never stop. If I'm out walking the dog, or if I'm out with my son, or even if I'm sitting on the porch reading the paper, I'm listening to what's going on around me. So it's just really enriching. You really realize how much is around us.
Do you have a favorite type of bird species, or one that you just enjoy watching more than others?
Well, probably whichever one I'm looking at the moment. But birds that I've really enjoyed, especially since coming to Virginia, there's a species of bird called a prothonotary warbler, which is kind of a fancy name. It used to be called the golden swamp warbler, but that made too much sense, so it had to be changed. But it's a really beautiful golden bird with bluish wings and a green back, and it nests in forested wetlands, and it's the only warbler east of the Mississippi that will nest in cavities. And I actually have the good fortune to do some research with these birds, and so I get to spend a lot of time with them. They're just a gorgeous bird, and they're pretty easy to see. And folks in the Richmond area can see them. I know that Three Lakes Park and Nature Center has some nest boxes up in the Richmond area, so that's a chance for folks to maybe see a really beautiful bird that they've missed before.
I relate to that, Steve, because I remember I was kayak fishing the Chickahominy River, really in the swamp area of the Chickahominy River, and I saw my first prothonotary warbler out there while I was fishing, and I saw it. I'm like, wow, that's a beautiful bird. I couldn't wait to get back in and check my field guide and identify it, and I've seen them since in that area, and they are beautiful. Really enjoy watching them. One of my favorites is the indigo bunting. I love that when they come up for the summer, they're beautiful. They're very small, iridescent blue. They're gorgeous birds. That's my favorite. Just wanted to add that in.
I absolutely. And again, some long-legged waders, so your herons and egrets are really graceful and easy to see. And you bring up a good point, Chris, with fishing and seeing birds. Hunters and anglers, I think they often don't realize that they're great wildlife viewers, and most of them are birders, even if they won't admit it. But they're true sportsmen, and they're out in the outdoors, and it's part of that whole outdoor experience. Even if your primary reason is to be out fishing or turkey hunting, you're noticing everything that's going on around you.
That's absolutely right. I mean, we like doing that because we really appreciate all of the wildlife in the outdoors. That's right.
We call this our weekly wildlife segment. A lot of times we just focus on fishing, but today we certainly have lived up to the namesake with wildlife. Hey, Steve, thank you so much for taking the time to join us this morning. Really do appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Again, Steve Living, Terrestrial Biologist from the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries, joining Chris Dunnavant and myself here on our wildlife segment this weekend. Chris, as always, thank you for lining up another terrific guest.
Oh, it's you're welcome, Anthony, and I hope the listeners enjoyed it. And, we have a very well-rounded, diverse agency when it covers wildlife, and we just definitely want to bring that into this program so that our listeners can really appreciate all that we do at the Department of Game and Inland Fisheries.
And that's Chris Dunnavant from the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries, bringing another wildlife segment to a close. Stay tuned. We've got our game plan for the weekend when we come back here on The Weekend with Anthony Opperman.
The show is almost over, but the weekend is just getting started. More of The Weekend with Anthony Opperman is next on Sports Radio 910.